Thank you for taking part in our online Excel PivotTables class today. Before we begin, I want to show you where to find the resources that we'll be using throughout class. If you go to our website at mybpl.org and follow the Services menu to Computers, then select Computer Classes, and finally scroll down and you can see the Excel PivotTables handout. That'll be a PDF that you can read along with, and the Excel PivotTables class project. That'll be an Excel file that you can work with. In class today we're using Excel 2016, but this file will work with any versions of Excel going backwards up to 2007. I've already downloaded the file that we're going to be using, so I'm going to go ahead and open that up. If you would like to use your own data to work with in class today, that's perfectly fine, but we are going to be doing a lot of examples, so I'd encourage you to play along if you want to work with that. With that, I'm ready to begin. Excel PivotTables are a dynamic version of Excel lists. They're going to allow us to sort, filter, and rearrange the data in real time. What they're most valuable for is taking large amounts of data and making it easily digestible and easily understandable. Whenever we create charts or complex tables, we're looking to present our information in a clearer way or to present it emphasizing whatever aspects of that data are important to us. And we're going to be able to do that very nicely with pivot tables. I'm going to create one here together, and we're going to look at all the different changes we can make and the ways that we can adjust it. So first you need to have the data put in. Now, you need to be careful when creating the data set for a pivot table. Anything that you're going to want to sort or pivot on, you need to have a value for. So you don't want to work with data that has a lot of blank spots in it or a lot of unfilled in options. That will create problems later on with some of your tables. The actual actions to make this involve highlighting what we have. So I click and drag across there. Then I go to the Insert tab in Excel 2016. This will be slightly different on one version or another. And I choose Pivot Chart among the chart options. Now I don't want to just make a chart, I also want to make a table because I want to show you both options there. So I'm going to do Pivot Chart and Pivot Table. When I click this, it asks a couple of important questions. The first one is, where is the data that we're going to pivot on coming from? Now by default it will go with what we have just highlighted, as you can see here. The worksheet exercise 1, cells A1 through F29. That's that range that I just highlighted. However, you can use an external data source. I mentioned this later on in the handout. If you have data from an existing database, another spreadsheet, even another pivot table that was created, there are a lot of options out there and you can go and grab those. But we're going to stick with the ones that are right in front of us here. Secondly, do you want this pivot table and chart that you're creating to exist in a new worksheet? That's usually my preference. Or do you want to have it in the existing worksheet off to the side? If you've had Excel classes with me before, you know I strongly recommend against having multiple objects in one tab. I find it's confusing, hard to read, and makes difficulties when printing. So I recommend making a new worksheet whenever possible. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and we see it jumps right to the new worksheet. Now so far we just see the tools for creating the pivot table. We don't see any table itself. On the right hand side here, we see the categories for all the different things that we can make. If we were to go back to the Exercise 1 tab, you would see that these were the categories across the top, the fields, if you will, for our spreadsheet. We can just check the ones that we want and trust Excel to put them into the right places for us. We see we have filters, legends for the series, values, and axis categories. And if I were to just check all of these, it would start filling things in. However, sometimes it doesn't put things in the way that we would like. I'm going to make this a little simpler first, taking a couple things out of the equation, particularly the month, and go over what we see there, and then I'll show you how we can make adjustments to where it puts these things. Now, if you look on the side, we see filters that were created here. Things like the axis categories. We have the weekday. And then we have the values that we're calculating on. Right now it's adding up the number of hours, the number of days, number of weeks, and the number of sales. It's possible that we only wanted to calculate based on sales. Maybe that's the metric that we're concerned with here. So we take off hours, days, and weeks, and we're just checking what weekdays do we have the most sales? Maybe we want to put in another axis, say, okay, what hours do we have the most sales? We can go through there. Looking at the data, all of the hour listings are the same, so I could say that's not very informative. That doesn't add much to our chart. I'm going to uncheck that. And say, okay, let's toss in, whoops, I unchecked sales instead of hours. Easy mistake. I bring it back. Let's drag in days. Say, okay, now we have different days of the month, and we're getting some information in there. We might be able to see one thing or another. We could also drag this over to Legend and see it as a cross-section, where we have the days of the week across the, or days of the month across the top, and the days of the week down here. If we don't find that helpful, we could do the exact same thing with the month. So we can take a look there and have those going across like so. So you see all these changes that I'm making allow us to very quickly arrange the data in different ways. Imagine all the copying and pasting you would have to do to create different charts to show all of the things as we did there. This also throws in a lot of functions for us. All of these functions that you see across the bottom here are essentially sum-if functions, as are the ones across the right, the grand totals or the specific monthly totals. So it's doing a lot of complicated calculations very quickly for us. Now we can arrange these in all sorts of different ways. We're going to start out with the basic one there, and we just see the grid where it's showing all the sales that took place on Sunday and what month they were in. So that was in July. You can see we had a relatively small amount of data in this spreadsheet, so we don't have a lot of overlaps. Let's create another spreadsheet and see how that comes out. So we go here, I highlight all of this, and I again go to Insert, Pivot Chart and Pivot Table. And I will again check all of the data. Now, I could look at this and say, what do we want to calculate based on? Well, we're worried about attendance to classes. That's what I'm mostly concerned with here. But this is hard to read as it is laid out, so I want to divide things up a little bit. First things first, I'm going to move the month to something we didn't use before, a different filter. Then I'm going to make the time a different axis from the class. So now you can see I can look at different classes with data in all these spots. Compare that to the first worksheet. I talked about in the earlier description, we don't want to have a lot of spots or categories that don't have data in them when we were talking about creating the Excel pivot tables at the beginning. This is an example of a pivot table that does not work in that way. This has a lot of blank spots in the data. This one, on the other hand, is filled in nicely and allows me to do a lot of comparisons. So I could say, okay, Introduction to Excel tends to do better in the evening than in the afternoon. However, the beginner's computer class is more popular in the afternoon than the evening. That could be very useful, and it's easy to see here in a way that this data was not at a glance. When I put the month in the filters, let me show you what that did. If we go here and look at the top, see right now we're looking at all the months. If I were to break it down, I could select June, and then it shows me the classes that happened in that month. July, the ones that we had there, and August, the ones that we had there. So sometimes you might want to break things down using the filters in a small way. Other times you might want to look at them collectively and say, show me everything, or say select multiple ones and say, just show me June and July. If, for example, I had an entire year's worth of data there, it might be worth comparing the evening classes in the winter when it gets cold and dark early compared to the evening classes in the summer and see what things were more popular. In this case, we have a smaller data set, so it works better with all of them. It allows for more comparisons. I haven't talked yet about the chart part of the pivot table and pivot chart, but it also creates a visual representation here. Now, if you didn't want that, you could select it and you can delete it, but this can also be good if you want to, again, just show it more visually or print it up or display it in whatever way like that. Let's do one more example of this. I'm going to highlight all of this data. Again, go to Insert, Pivot Chart and Pivot Table. same things we've done so far. Now I'm going to select all these options. But we're going to do things a little bit different this time. I'm again going to move the month into the filters. And we're going to look over these comparisons. I'm going to move the campaign to one axis and the city to another. But I want to have the sum of more than one thing for these. Now I'm going to, for the visual purposes of this, so that we can see it better, because this is getting kind of big, I'm going to uncheck a couple of these for right now. But I want to show a situation where you can calculate on different things, perhaps for a different audience or for different presentations, or whatever it is that you wanted to encourage. So if the argument that you were making was best supported by comparing the cost and the profit of these different ad campaigns that I made up, then we might want to have those options checked. If what we were interested in was not so much the cost, but how many were redeemed, then I could have that checked. So you see, we can have different values being calculated in there, as opposed to other spreadsheets that we looked at earlier that had just one value that was being calculated within the worksheet. And you can have more and more of these, but of course, the more you add, the more complicated your information becomes. So one of the values of the pivot table is that you can add and remove things quickly. So this might be one of those situations where it makes sense to add and remove the data that you're calculating and say, okay, right now we are talking about the resulting sales. That's what I want to present and show that the local ads did not work very well for resulting sales in any of those locations. But if I go to the cost was a lot lower. So you can present it however you like using the different results there. That's how we create a pivot table. You use these different ways to arrange the data, to move your values in and out of them, after selecting first the data that you want, and simply play around with it. Oops. Dragging that into place. Adjust the data to best present the information that you want or to find what you are looking for. Again, the strength of this is the ability to make changes to it in real time. Finally, I want to talk about using the pivot chart and pivot table tools. Those of you that have inserted an image or created a chart before might know that when you create a new object in an Excel spreadsheet, it changes the ribbon up here at the top and it gives you a new set of tools to work with. Right now I have the pivot chart selected, and so I can click on Analyze, Design, Format. But I want to focus a little bit more on the table today, so I'm going to select that, and you see Analyze and Design as the tools that are available. I want to look over these briefly for us, just a couple of key points. Now, right here in the middle of Analyze, we see Refresh. So if you had gone back to the other spreadsheet where the data was contained and made changes or updated it, it should dynamically update, but that's not always reliable. And if you want to make sure you have the right information, clicking Refresh is a quick way to pull the newest information from the target source, especially if it's an external data source. So if this is going to another database and somebody is making changes, you want to click Refresh before you would print or present this information. This is also where you would go to change the data source if you had an updated place for data. Generally speaking, I would probably create a new pivot table myself, but if you had put a lot of time into the layout and formatting and construction of this, but you just wanted to work with it with new data, it might make sense to simply grab a new data source there. I also want to briefly look at the design options, because we do make this with the intention of presenting it. In the handout I mentioned auto formatting, and there are a lot of options that are available for that. You can see in the built-in design tools here, and if you look at the chart as I click on this, little changes to the aesthetic, and I can scroll down. We can see how they can color code the data categories that way. And the bigger your pivot table, the more of a difference that you'll see with some of these changes that come through. So these can be pretty helpful, and I encourage you to make experiments with them so you can see how it works. You see banded columns and banded rows. I wouldn't recommend using both of those. One or the other is fine. Just makes it visually easier to read across, especially again when you have large amounts of data. Column headers and row headers, do you want to have the categories going across explaining those? A lot of things you can test and experiment with. Same controls that you might have worked with when working with charts. If I go back to here, you can see things like format to change the color coding and the layouts. And you can right-click on any object within the chart just like you would a normal Excel chart, and you could format that data series, format the axis, whatever you want to do there. So all of those kinds of appearance changes are available for you. I hope you found this to be a helpful introduction. I would encourage you, if you have any further information about that you want to learn about pivot tables, to go to our website and underneath Learn, check out online courses and lynda.com, and they have extensive classes there as well. You would need a library card number here at the Bloomingdale Library, but if you have that, you can sign in through our website and not have to pay anything for use of it. Again, I hope this was helpful. Thank you very much, and hope to see you in further classes. Thanks. Bye.